You cannot continue to criminalize us simply because we are an inconvenience to your resource sector.
Dozens of anti-pipeline protesters have blocked the entrances and exits to the BC legislature in a show of support for Indigenous hereditary leaders and their fight against a natural gas pipeline being built through their traditional territory. RCMP have been enforcing a court order against those blocking construction, resulting in a number of arrests, and other protests are happening right across the country. Over here in Ontario, supporters of the Wet'suwet'en protesters have set up blockades for 6 straight days on the Toronto to Montreal rail line, effectively halting trains along the corridor. Via Rail says 157 passenger trains have been cancelled, affecting more than 24,000 travelers, and CN Rail is shutting down, quote, significant sections of its rail network. The CBC's Jorge Barrera is at the blockade in the community of Tyendega, Ontario. Hi, Jorge. Tell us a bit about what's been happening there today.
Hi. All right, well, tensions are rising a bit now because about 40 minutes ago, 2 OPP liaison officers walked to the tracks wearing their police vests with a message, and they said that the OPP considers the situation has now become, quote, dire, and that they consider what's happening behind me an unlawful demonstration, and that they will be enforcing the injunction, meaning that police cruisers could be coming down this road in front of me at any time to try to end this demonstration that has shut down rail traffic for the last 6 days. Now, this was a marked change in tone from earlier in the day when 3 OPP liaison officers wearing civilian clothes came to these same tracks with gifts of maple syrup. And along with them came a court official, a court enforcement officer, with the injunction that they read out. But they just talked after that. The demonstrators set up a table and they started talking about the Turo Wampum. And here's a little bit of what was said during those discussions earlier today.
Well, I love my people, and I'm concerned that you're foolish and irresponsible and ill-equipped to handle this situation.
I just would like to say that I think you made a point, and I think a lot of people have heard you. And I'm not sure, but I know I'd really like to go home, and I wonder if maybe you guys would like to go home now too, to your families. And
this is our home. We are home. You're on our front lawn. We'd like you to go home too, please.
So the Turo Wampum was a 17th century agreement between the Iroquois and the European colonists. And basically the agreement was, you stick to your own affairs, we don't meddle in each other's internal affairs. And so the message earlier today from the Mohawks was that by bringing in an injunction, you are meddling in our affairs. Let's discuss this. Let's talk this through the agreement that we have. And I think we just have the clip of the 2 liaison officers that were here just 40 minutes ago. And here's a little bit of what the message that they delivered.
The situation has become dire with the tracks and the closures and the impacts from that. So this has to end. So the OPP is investigating this as an unlawful demonstration, as an unlawful protest, and you are accountable, and the OPP will be enforcing the injunction.
Jorge, given what we just heard in that clip, there have been, and seeing as the protests have spilled into multiple provinces, there's a lot of questions being directed particularly to the federal government about what they're going to do about the situation. What are they saying today?
Well, from the beginning, with the Wet'suwet'en, when the Wet'suwet'en situation started to, bubble up, the federal government has kept an arm's length distance from this, saying it's a BC issue. And it's the same thing with what's happening on these rails. And Transport Minister Marc Garneau spoke about that today, and also about the other rail blockades happening in BC and near Montreal and Ganawagi. Here's a little bit what he had to say.
It is up to the provinces. They are the ones who have the jurisdiction to act with respect to those injunctions. It is not the federal government. We hope this will get resolved because it's having an important impact on the economy of the country. Not only that, it also potentially presents some safety considerations, some safety concerns.
So the federal government has taken this position consistently over the years. I mean, there was a blockade here in 2007 where these rails and the 401 was shut down. Again, the federal government said it's a provincial jurisdiction. And just to note, in 2015, the Public Safety's Governance Operations Center did a study on the potential for fallout from the raid on the Wet'suwet'en and concluded that they felt that BC had the resources to deal with it. Vashi?
All right, thanks so much, Jorge. Really appreciate that update. The CBC's Jorge Barrera for us in Tyendina, Ontario. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, meanwhile, was asked about this growing anti-pipeline movement in BC and Ontario. Here's a little bit of what he said earlier today.
The single greatest thing that Canada could do to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions and to address the climate issues would be massively to increase our exports of LNG. If these folks were actually concerned about CO2 emissions, they would be calling for the acceleration of the Coastal GasLink project, not trying to shut down our economy.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney there calling on police to intervene. He's reacting to the ongoing protests and blockades in support of the Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs protests over the Coastal GasLink project in northern BC. CN stopped all trains in its east-west corridor due to a blockade near Belleville and on its northern main line in BC between Prince George and Prince Rupert. Via Rail has also canceled more than 100 trains. As we reported off the top of the show, protesters also blocked access to the BC legislature all day, where the throne speech is set to be presented. When Federal Transport Minister Marc Garneau was asked if the government will intervene, this is what he said.
I can tell you that the Government of Canada is seized of it because of the impacts with respect to safety, with respect to the economy, with respect to inconvenience to passengers. And I, as Transport Minister, am following this very, very closely and am in touch with the railway companies. I know that they have obtained injunctions in certain cases, and it is, as I said before, ultimately up to the provinces to enforce those injunctions.
Time for the Power Panel to weigh in on this subject. In Vancouver, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Stockwell Day joins us. Over in Regina, Merelda Fiddler, PhD student at Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy and recipient of the Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship. Over in Montreal, I believe, David Hertel, former Quebec Liberal Immigration and Environment Minister and Council at Fasken. And here next to me in studio, commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin. Hi, everybody. Hey. Nice to see you. Merelda, I want to start with you. The question we're trying to get at here by playing those various clips is sort of who bears responsibility or where does the pressure lie for what levels of government? Obviously, this has been a conversation so far very much focused on the BC government and the specifics of the protest and the concerns from the hereditary chiefs. But now it's very much boiled over the borders into other cities and other provinces. And there's all these train stoppages, et cetera, et cetera. So what does that do to the role that is expected of the federal government, do you think?
Well, I think the federal government here is, obviously reaping what it's sown over the last however many hundreds of years, as we have not ever really worked out this relationship. So what you have are groups of people who, for Indigenous people, were sort of given this form of government that was not their traditional government. You have hereditary chiefs who are now trying to take their place. You have other elected leaders who are signing agreements. And so you have these two groups within the communities that aren't communicating and also don't agree with one another. And then to hear somebody say that we should then for sure just force the police into the middle of that situation, which requires a lot more consultation, a lot more, negotiation and those sorts of things. And just to say we're going to sort of force police into that, well, those are lives of real people, and these things are escalating quite quickly. So I think, the federal government, provincial governments, municipalities, they've all got to start getting in there and negotiating with more than just one group. You really have to be able to get in there and work with those hereditary groups. They're coming back, and as we start talking about reconciliation and what all of those things looks like, we're going to have to be negotiating with more than one group of people.
What's interesting, David, is my understanding is Nathan Cullen, who's a former well-known, federal MP, was some sort of acting in the role of an intermediary between the hereditary chiefs and the BC government, because that's who the chiefs want to be negotiating with, not the company. That's at least based on the information that I've read. And then Murray Rankin is also sort of involved in that. And there are some discussions apparently happening right now. We don't know what the results of those are. But I'm wondering from your perspective, David, how difficult this is to navigate, particularly not just for the BC government, but particularly for the federal government right now.
It's very difficult to navigate because in Quebec we have quite a history of First Nations blocking some bridges, even a tragic history at that. So you have to move very slowly, and especially when you have MPs, different jurisdictions. Ultimately, it's about making sure that maybe there's certain conditions that can be added to the project, but at the same time, there is rule of law. And so nobody wants to see violence. No one wants to see escalation. But at the same time, if I can just take a step back, and if you're not following this like we are, and you're just ordinary Canadians just watching this, in the past few weeks, you've had on Trans Mountain, Federal Court of Appeals judgment saying that this can move ahead, that the First Nations don't have a veto right on projects. You have band councils saying we're for different projects, including this one. Then you have hereditary chiefs saying no. People in general don't make these types of differences. So you have a lot of conflicting messages coming out of the First Nations. And it's a very complex question, I agree. But at the same time, it's very confusing to follow and to see, well, who's right, who's wrong in this? And at the end of the day, and like we saw in Montreal a few months ago, actually, and I'm switching tracks here, but at the same time, Extinction Rebellion blocked a bridge in Montreal during rush hour. It didn't add to sympathy. It actually said, hold on a second, these are lives, this is the economy. People are trying to get to work here. This is not the right way to get your message across. So this may actually backfire to the ultimate people this is targeted to, which is the general public opinion on this.
To both their points, though, Françoise, I mean, the federal government has said and articulated many times since they were first elected back in, the first mandate, when they were a bit of a different government, at least in size, that reconciliation was a priority, right? And then at the same time, they've championed, they were there for the announcement that this project was going to open in BC. They've very much said a lot of the time that it's the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. So how difficult is it for them to kind of thread the needle?
It is absolutely hellish for them right now because it's the biggest hot potato that, like David was saying, you have to thread so carefully. Yes, there's centuries of bad acting with First Nations, but there's more than that. It's complicated. Like David was saying, if it starts hurting people, we're talking about maybe a lack of propane in certain areas of the country, of other, it's the merchandise.
You can't get on a train right now.
No, exactly. A lot of people cannot commute, so it has impact on their work. And it's like any protest. A protest is good as long as they pass a message. We're not sure of the message right now, of every message. We know what the message of the hereditary chiefs are, but a lot of groups have recouped for other reasons everywhere in Canada. So it becomes a bit confused. Lots of different jurisdiction, legal-wise. This will not be settled legally. I keep saying this because there's already injunctions. There's already different means at their disposition. You don't want to send the police with their big boots and get them all out and create even a more explosive.
That's kind of what's happening.
I know, but they try to do it in a very almost gentle fashion. It might be a bit more. It might be different at some point in time, but I do think that maybe those who agree, those band leaders who agree with the project, maybe we should hear a bit more of what they have to say, and we need leadership at the top, maybe from the federal government, to just say, okay, let's sit down and try to find a solution, because we can't go on.
I guess that's my question, Stockwell, because I was listening very carefully to what Minister Garneau said today and what Premier Horgan have said. And most of the time right now, I mean, they're both acknowledging that there's an issue, that they're concerned, they're, quote unquote seized, but there is a deference to the process that's underway legally. So the companies or the train companies have sought injunctions to stop the protest. They have mostly been successful. Therefore, police come in, they sort of try to disrupt one protest. But it just doesn't seem that simple anymore. And so I'm wondering what you think of, does the federal government need to do more?
I think Françoise has made probably the most important point in this, and that is we rarely get to hear the side of the many First Indigenous groups and communities that are supporting this project. That's not their fault, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, Vashti, but whenever these protests are covered, whether the media content on the story is 1 minute or 10 minutes or an hour, the protesters get about 90% of the airtime. And so the unsuspecting public think, wow, every Aboriginal person in the country is against this. No, this 600 kilometer pipeline that's linking Dawson Creek with Kitimat with natural gas that could get to Asia and get Asian coal offline and reduce global emissions. This particular project supported by 20 communities, 20 First Nations
20 band
communities,
councils.
20 band councils representing their communities, which is going to flow, and in the process of flowing, over $800 million to their communities, giving them generational support for health programs, education, generational jobs. And this process that they've gone through in terms of consultation has been a model of consultation and listening. But all we hear, or most of what we hear in the media, are the protesters. And the protesters that are out there, the First Nations people that are protesting, with respect, they have the right to do it. They are hurting their own people in a devastating way, damaging their hopes for the future, and at the same time, taking part in, as we've already heard, taking part in certain protests which are upsetting the lives of millions of Canadians, many whom, again, are also First Nations people. So a little bit more of fair coverage, and it might embolden those many First Nations leaders who support this. It might embolden them a bit to speak up, because they feel a little bit intimidated right now.
Yeah, I take your...
We clearly need to hear both sides of the story.
I take your point on the level of support. I think the reason today that we're covering this is because of the effect that those protests have had. I mean, there's a certain point where you can't ignore what's happening. It's clearly, I mean, there's trains that are no longer running. I completely understand what you're saying. We've pointed out many times on the show that there are 20 band councils, that some have held referendums on this, in fact, that they're elected leaders, but that's, you can't pretend they're not happening.
But many of those protesters, if they were looking at themselves in the news, right now they go, we're winning, look, we got all the coverage. If they saw balanced coverage of it, on this, and they realized how many Canadians, including First Nations people, support this environmentally friendly pipeline, if they saw that day after day, you know what? A lot of those protesters are reasonable people. They've just been given the wrong information. You'd see them start to fade away. But they're never given balanced information, and never is the rest of Canada. Or sorry, hardly ever.
Quick final word to you, Merelda.
Well, actually, I agree with Stockwell on one point, and that's that there is a real confusion in terms of the information out there. And if you could connect some of the traditional people who are on the land every day with some of the scientists who have solid scientific information about this, you might be able to quell some of that. But again, that comes through negotiation, not through police. Once you send the police in there, you send a message that you're not going to listen and you're not going to work with people. So while there are really good reasons to have these lines, you're never going to get it unless actual scientists can connect with those people who are on the land all the time and they can actually talk. It really is about more than just the leaders, even though, you know, there's a lot of ministers on this panel today, so I feel a little nervous saying that, but it really is not about them. It really is about all of these other groups, because the ministers and the leaders aren't getting any of that information across. So you've got to try something new, and it can't be just risk more lives by throwing more police into the fray.
In British Columbia, the NDP government has just kick-started its spring session with a speech from the throne, but it didn't exactly go off without a hitch.
You cannot continue to criminalize us simply because we are an inconvenience to your resource sector.
Dozens of anti-pipeline protesters surrounded the BC Ledge today, blocking entrances to the building. Some politicians and staff had to be escorted in by security. The protest is a show of support for Indigenous hereditary leaders and their fight against a natural gas pipeline being built on their traditional territory. RCMP have been enforcing a court order against those blocking construction, resulting in a number of arrests, but other protests have spilled over across the country. Rob Shaw is the legislative columnist for the Vancouver Sun. He joins us now from the legislature in Victoria. Hey, Rob, great to see you.
Thanks for having me on.
Give us a bit of an idea of what this was like today. I think you were around for the whole thing. Describe for us what happened.
It was pretty chaotic. I mean, we're no strangers to protests here at the BC legislature, and there have certainly been bigger ones. This was only a couple hundred people, but what they did is they mapped out every entrance to the building and positioned people who were linking arms in front of all those entrances. And so you had a whole bunch of MLAs returning to Victoria to start the spring session of the legislature, and they couldn't get through into the building. And these awkward encounters, there was our agriculture minister who was kind of face down by a protester with a feather and couldn't get in to the entrance. You had the education minister who kind of squeezed halfway in, and then security guards had to grab him by the arm and pull him to get him into the building. You had journalists who were like physically pushed and unable to get in. So it was a very calculated protest designed to disrupt the NDP government on its throne speech day and kind of interrupt all that ceremony and pageantry that goes with that throne speech. And it succeeded because this morning's festivities were delayed, and then the throne speech this afternoon, there was some stuff in it, but it was entirely overshadowed by the protests.
And talk a little bit about that, I guess the sort of cause and effect of all of this, and that is the hereditary chiefs who are protesting this LNG pipeline and the pressure, I guess, faced by John Horgan to deal with it. What has he said so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, John Horgan is in a kind of a contradictory position here. On the one hand, he is the first jurisdiction in Canada under his watch to pass legislation enshrining UNDRIP into law. And when that was done in December, the NDP patted themselves on the back here and said, look at how we have advanced reconciliation. And then on the other hand, he's been a very clear advocate of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and the big $40 billion LNG terminal to be built in Kitimat, LNG Canada. Its main supply of natural gas is going to come from the Coastal GasLink pipeline that is being blockaded right now by the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. So he's in this weird position where he promotes a project and he's issued all the permits for the pipeline, but it contradicts all the efforts he's sort of been making on the reconciliation and the UNDRIP side. And so it was deeply embarrassing for his government, the first to pass UNDRIP into law, to be protested by people chanting UNDRIP, and First Nations leaders who had stood side by side with the premier not that long ago to praise the NDP government's actions on it. But I think in the long term, Premier Horgan sees a bigger political benefit in promoting LNG. It's the biggest private project in the history of Canada, $40 billion, lots of jobs, lots of revenue. He thinks that's kind of an election-winning issue, and it will get him through the short-term pain of a protest on a day like today.
And so where do you see things going from here? My understanding was Nathan Cullen was tasked a little bit with trying to negotiate with those hereditary chiefs, Murray Rankin as well. Do you know anything about the status of that? Like, is there any hope for a solution or none at all?
Well, those kind of mediated talks failed. And so what you hear from the premier now is that he expects people to follow the rule of law, which is essentially that he expects a pipeline to be built. It's reached all the permits that are necessary. It has the court backing through court rulings, and he said it's going to be built. And he likened it to the Trans Mountain pipeline, which the NDP here has opposed through various court challenges and has lost all of them. And the premier said, look, I'm not happy with Trans Mountain. I don't want it built, but the courts have ruled. First Nations leaders are not happy with Coastal GasLink, some of them. But it's going to be built. And he believes that by getting 20 elected First Nation councils to support the pipeline, that's good enough for him, even though one group of hereditary chiefs does not support it. So look, despite BC kind of being this leader on First Nations reconciliation with UNDRIP, there's no playbook out here. There's no checklist. There's no way to get around disputes where an elected council votes in support of one project and the hereditary chiefs vote against it. The NDP government has no clue how to solve that divide. The national government with Justin Trudeau has no clue there. So it's kind of this, uncharted territory that the NDP here are trying to get through, and it is very complicated and very difficult for them.
Sure is. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Rob. Pleasure to have you on
Thank
as
you.
always. Rob Shaw, the legislative columnist for the Vancouver Sun from Victoria. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.